Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session with us on Aucademy. I am Dr. Chloe Farahar. I am a shaved-headed white woman with giant glasses, and I'm wearing my Rolling Stones jumper, sitting in my office with some of my little stimmy toys and things in the background. And I'm very excited. I'm joined by Dr. Nick Walker. If you wouldn't mind saying hello and doing a physical description for us.
Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Walker. I am a shaved-headed Jewish woman, but since I'm a trans woman who's not medically transitioning, I just look like an old bald dude. And I am sitting here in my lovely office. There's a white wall and a couch behind me and a window up to one side, wearing a black shirt and a big old pair of headphones, and lovely to be here.
Fantastic. And it's 11 a.m. where you are, isn't it?
It is 11 a.m. and a wonderfully foggy morning.
Because I keep getting confused with the time difference. Hello, lovely people who are starting to say hi in the comment section. We are talking today, I say we, I'm being educated because I really don't know enough about this topic at all, on neuroqueer life and literature. So we're going to kind of hopefully have a rambly discussion because I know that Nick prefers spontaneity over my need for structure, which I think always goes really interestingly. Do you want to give a very brief, we usually ask all our guests very briefly who they are and what their dedicated interests are, which I know you have quite a number.
I do. This could go on for a while, but I'll see what I can do. Yeah, so I am Dr. Nick Walker, and I have been involved in autistic community and culture and in neurodiversity movement and neurodiversity theory for a long time now, for 2 decades now. So I've really kind of been a part of watching it grow, and over the years, so particularly, I guess, originally in just the early online discussions among autistic people where the neurodiversity movement kind of took shape. I had, I was involved in discussions there, and then for the past decade or so, I've been publishing various things, and a lot of that has become kind of foundational to the emerging field of neurodiversity theory and neurodiversity studies. And lately, I'm very focused on this thing, on this concept of neuroqueer, and this thing I'm calling Neuroqueer Theory, and of course neuroqueer practice. And so that's a big part of what I'm playing with. I am a psychology professor. I guess when I first got into this, I was, just becoming an undergrad college student, and now I'm a psychology professor. I teach at California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a lovely school based in San Francisco, and I teach in the undergraduate psychology program there, and in the somatic psychology grad program, where I teach people to do body-oriented psychotherapy. And so that is a driving interest of mine, which we'll talk more about because it's very relevant to this whole idea of neuroqueer. My focus very much is on the entwining of body, psyche, and culture. And so, focused on that. I'm also managing editor of the tiny little worker-owned publishing house called Autonomous Press, and in that capacity, I'm very interested in neuroqueer literature and what that means, and how to promote neuroqueer literature in general, neuroqueer speculative fiction. Autonomous Press has this annual anthology called the Spoon Knife Anthology. That's a multi-genre neuroqueer short story memoir and poetry anthology. And so I've edited a couple volumes of that. It's kind of rotating editorship. And I'm a speculative fiction writer myself and a webcomic writer, co-writer, creator of a webcomic called Weird Luck. That's sort of just in its early stages of developing a reader base and such. And so all of that for me, it sounds like a very diverse collection of interests, but it all ties together for me. And this concept of neuroqueer is part of what ties it all together or emerges from it.
Fantastic. And I can see how that's the case. So I've definitely made a couple of notes to say, yes, can we have a discussion of what this means? So before I move on to actually the sort of the meat of the discussion, as it were, we also like to ask, when did our guest discover they were autistic? If you're okay to explain that.
Good question. Well, I'm old. I'm 53 years old, and so my generation was one that where a lot of us, unless we were non-speaking, did not get diagnosed correctly in childhood. And in fact, interestingly, I was non-speaking about half of the time, but because I could speak some of the time, it was just assumed I was being difficult when I didn't speak. So nobody even caught that I was a partially non-speaking autistic. So so I got all sorts of, wide collection of incorrect diagnoses throughout my childhood and adolescence. And I didn't figure out I was autistic until I was about 30. Yeah, just about 30. I started, I got a job tutoring. I was working in a tutoring center as a reading tutor for mostly neurodivergent students of various sorts. And I had this rapport with the autistic kids, and they all, they moved like me and they thought like me, and there was an instant rapport and ability to work together and understanding that came from me just being me around them. And so that's when it started to click for me. And I was very fortunate. People ask me sometimes, so there's so many adult autistic people out there who did not get diagnosed when they were younger, and are wondering about official diagnosis and should they pursue one. And people ask my advice on that all the time. And what I say, first of all, fuck diagnosis. Non-autistic psych professionals should not be the gatekeepers of who's in our community. So that's not, you don't need, it's obviously ridiculous when you look at any other marginalized group. You don't need a shrink to tell you that you're gay and are part of the gay community. You don't need a shrink to tell you what your ethnicity is if you're a member of a marginalized ethnic group. It's just ridiculous to allow non-autistic people, especially non-autistic people working in a field that's historically oppressed us, to allow them that level of power over us to tell us who we are. So I'm absolutely, just the idea of diagnosing autism seems as archaic to me as diagnosing queerness. And at the same time, of course, often we need diagnoses on the books for the purpose of getting accommodations of one kind or another. The fact is, just if you need accommodations at your school or workplace or whatever, because we have such an ableist society, usually the only way to get those accommodations is by getting a diagnosis so you can legally insist on the accommodations. And so diagnosis is useful for those reasons. And likewise for insurance reasons, likewise diagnosing a kid if you need some sort of work with your kids, sensory integration work or something like that to help them, or you need insurance to pay for, augmented communication devices if your child is non-speaking or just communicates better by typing. There's a lot of reasons why you might need a diagnosis just given the way society is structured. So yeah, what I tell people is only get the diagnosis, only pursue diagnosis if you need it for specific benefits, if there are specific physical benefits that you will get from getting the diagnosis. Don't get it just to know who you are, because the way you know who you are is by knowing who you are. And nobody else can give you that or should be allowed to give you that. Anyway, this is a digression, as I'm prone to do.
Well, I mean,
because
is it all right if I quickly just add, that's why we ask, when did you discover of our guests? Because it's for exactly that reason. So everything,
exactly,
absolutely agree with what you've just said, is that it's about our discovery.
Right.
And for many of us, I mean, personally for myself, the diagnosis I thought would give me answers, it didn't. It gave me more questions.
Yes.
So everything I've understood about myself has come from the community. It hasn't come from a non-autistic therapist or diagnostician or anything like that. All my knowledge about how to understand my autistic self is from the community.
Likewise, exactly. And I really appreciated the way you asked it, that you do ask discover rather than diagnose. The reason I brought up that digression about diagnosis is just to say that once I started, I was in an unusual position. Once I was in this tutoring position and I figured out that I was autistic, because I was in this sort of high-level tutoring world where we, worked with people who did all these neuropsych assessments and such. I was in this very lucky position right in that moment in my life to approach the people I worked with who did neuropsych assessments and get an assessment off the books. And so I was able to get a diagnosis without having it be part of any official record, which is what I prefer. So yeah, so it was so I sort of got Schrodinger's diagnosis there in a way, because it's, that I got it out of curiosity. It was an interesting experience at the time.
Fantastic. Yeah, I always love asking the question. I mean, the majority, I say, which is something I need to work on in terms of the guests that I have on, I would say the majority discovered their autistic identities much later in life. And when I say that, it might be teenage years, but basically not children. Very rarely have we had somebody who was recognised as autistic as a child. And that's something I need to work on in terms of who I invite. So I think the only person I can think of is JJ. So JJ we had on talking about their experiences of ABA for the majority of their life, were diagnosed as a child. So yes, but it's always interesting to hear different people's discovery journeys, which are really, I think, quite empowering for a lot of people. Fantastic, thank you. So many thoughts and questions then. Shall we just start with the basics? So what is neuroqueer? To be neuroqueer or to neuroqueer?
Ah, wonderful. I'm glad you asked. So it is it is intentionally, I think, or by its nature, a difficult to define concept, but there's two main ideas here behind this concept of neuroqueer. And one is that in a lot of ways, neurodivergence behaves like gender, or neurodiversity behaves like gender. So there's, if you look at the particular ways that neurodivergent people, autistic people in particular, have been, that neurodivergence has been pathologized, the particular ways that neurodivergent people are marginalized and abused and such, there are certain ways that it mirrors queer oppression, and the experience of people who are gender non-compliant and sexually non-compliant. And so there's this mirroring and this idea of the central to queer theory is this idea of queering gender, queering sexuality, queering how we do our gender and our sexuality, queer as a verb. And so part of that, so part of the idea of neuroqueer is extending that into neurodivergence. How do we queer our neurocognitive performance, our neurocognitive selves? What does it mean to queer neurotypicality? And so that's half of it, which I'm sure we'll talk a good deal more about in the coming hour. The other half of it is that neuronormativity and heteronormativity are entwined and inextricable. So this idea, when I talk about normativity, there's this whole our culture is built so much around imposing certain norms on people. This is the way to be normal, to be a normal person. And that normativity, which is compulsory, which is forced on people, and people are punished and stigmatized and attacked and abused in various ways for deviating from normativity. That normativity is a heteronormativity, that is, it pushes people towards this heterosexual gender binary. And it's also a neuronormativity. It pushes people towards a performance of neurotypicality. And the two are entwined with each other. So on the one hand, with neuroqueer, there's this idea that we can queer our minds, our embodied psyches, in the same way that gender is queered. And on the other hand, there's the idea that those are inseparable, that the queering of gender and the queering of the neurocognitive are ultimately entwined. You queer one enough, you're going to be queering the other. It's all just this big sticky mass of normativity that we're looking to, that we deviate from or are looking to free ourselves from. And ultimately, you get queer enough in one direction and you're deviating from both heteronormativity and neuronormativity. So yeah, that's the basics, I would say.
And this is where I wanted to bring in my anecdote of when, like I said to you before, I try very much to keep up with the narrative. So, there's a vast narrative. Please, everyone, if you only know, the word neurodiversity, for instance, please go in and look into the narrative, because it's a whole empowering narrative to use, and language that you can use to describe your neurodivergent experience of the world. So I did have this concept of neuroqueer, but definitely when I first had you on, it was just so illuminating for me. So I've said before on here, and I've said to you now as well, Nick, that I consider myself relatively, because I think it's always relatively cis straight woman. And when you discussed neuroqueer, it just really made so much sense to me that whilst I am, or consider myself, relatively cis and straight as a woman, I am not a neurotypical woman.
Right.
I am an autistic woman. And so the way you described neuroqueer was just so light bulb moment for me, because it was me recognizing for myself why I don't feel like a woman in the way I'm supposed to apparently feel like a woman.
Mm-hmm.
I shave my head, which queers my gender for multiple societies, not all societies. A lot of societies, though, the normative way of being a woman would be to have long flowing locks of hair and things like this. But for me, as an autistic woman with my extreme sensory sensitivity, I shave my head, which queers my gender. And it was just, when I say it, it's such a straightforward it's just clear. It's a very clear thing to understand about myself.
Yes.
But it's been really, really helpful. So Annette and I, so for people who saw the description, Annette was supposed to be here, but Annette actually flew out to visit her mum. So she's jet lagged, so she couldn't be here today. So Annette and I have been doing some work, because all of her PhD was on the lived experiences of autistic women, both cis and trans and non-binary people, as autistic people. And she saw that very much interplay of queering of gender because of being like, but I don't know necessarily at the start she would have used the term neuroqueer. And Annette herself has now recognised at 49 that although she knew she was queer in some capacity, so she originally thought she was bisexual, she's now recognised that she's pansexual. She's also now recognised at 49 that she is non-binary and things like this. And she just didn't have that language when she was younger. I think. So now we do talks on and bring in and discuss this fantastic concept of neuroqueer as well. So she will talk about that being queer in the way that people typically understand, i.e. her being non-bold they, she still uses feminine pronouns as well, so interchangeably. So she will still use, describe being non-binary or describe being pansexual and so on. And people understand that, even if there's still going to be people who struggle in the families that we're talking to, for instance, they understand that that concept of queer. And then you get to have me and my anecdote of your child, your young person, your adult autistic child may be also queering their gender the way that I do, because of I have a different neurology, have a different way of my body being in the world, and that means that my gender expression is different. And it was just so illuminating, and I was just so grateful for the ability that you gave me to recognize that. It was fantastic.
That's what I was hoping for. Wonderful. I'm hoping the concept has that sort of use for people, and it seems to be. It's really caught on rapidly. I see the concept, the term neuroqueer and neuroqueering, and the concept out in the world and showing up in everything from people's Twitter handles to scholarly papers, academic journal articles, and such. And it's just really it's resonating with people.
Is it fair to say, because I'm understanding it from this, like you say, that intersectionality, or just how did you describe it? Like it's very messy and sticky. Yes. Between gender, sexuality, and then your neurodivergence. So we are talking about something as a concept that is more or different or nuanced compared to the discussion we might have about being neurodivergent. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I would say that. I think that there's a key piece here, which is neuroqueer is first and foremost a verb, and I think that that's hard for some people to parse, because we've become accustomed culturally, in terms of like movements for social justice and that sort of thing. And we've really become very accustomed to the lens of identity politics and to thinking about what people are. But I think that's of limited utility. I think that's become a really restrictive model, despite its uses for some social justice purposes. It's got its limits, and queer, in queer theory, is a verb first and foremost. One queers gender. One subverts, defies, and challenges and messes with gender norms. And so that's the idea with neuroqueer too, that one is subverting and messing with and intentionally deviating from neuronormativity and heteronormativity at the same time. And so it's an action. It it is a verb, one neuroqueers. And of course, the neuroqueer as an identity label has become meaningful to many people now, which is lovely. But I think it's important to recognize that, what makes a person neuroqueer is ultimately the action of neuroqueering. It's not, I think, a way that someone is born. And when we use neurodivergent, I mean, you and I are both neurodivergent because we were born autistic. And, despite like bizarre anti-vaxxer narratives and people who are like, what made my child autistic? We were born autistic. We were autistic growing in the womb. And so we are neurodivergent. And that's very different, I think, from neuroqueer, which is about we're neuroqueer because we do this thing called neuroqueering. We allow ourselves to not stay within the box of heteronormativity and neuronormativity.
And I quite like this. Like I say, it's as an action.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I think if I think of myself and others who've masked for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, and then, so is it fair to say, and I'm definitely being like an undergrad student here, that it's when you come to realize that mask is there for one. A lot of us don't know for a very long time. We know something, but we just don't know quite what. And then that act of me, like I say, recognizing I was autistic, learning about what that meant for me in interaction with other autistic people, and making a conscious decision to shave my head, because I was like, this is why I hate hair. Right, I've got it now, and I don't have to do this performance. And that is to some extent what it felt like. I don't have to do this performance. I know for me why I need to do it. I also know that I don't need to meet these standards of what it means to be a woman. And I still feel like a woman. I just don't feel, and I actually would quite like, if Ellie doesn't mind, it's probably going to take up a bit of the screen, but this I thought was quite lovely. And I think they're also, it kind of adds to what I'm saying. So they're saying they were having this conversation with their autistic friend the other day, what they've realised that although I'm uncomfortable calling myself a woman, actually that discomfort goes away when I call myself an autistic woman. I think there's some lack of kinship in the former that's reinstated in the latter.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's what it gives people. And I like this
Mm-hmm.
idea of it being an action, that we're actually, to some extent, action can be quite empowering. It is that going against the norm in all the senses of the word.
Yes.
Which I quite enjoy.
Yes, me too. And that's part of I think that comment that you shared was lovely, because it gets at this idea of neuroqueering, that being and the intersectionality of neurodivergence and gender, this whole, that being an autistic woman is fundamentally different from being a neurotypical woman. It's not, it's a different performance of womanhood, and a different performance of whatever gender one is, and maybe, its own unique gender that doesn't conform to any neurotypical norms of gender. And, I also, of course, what you just brought up in your own experience is very much my experience as well. And in my case, as a trans woman who I recognized myself as a trans woman and came out as a trans woman pretty late in life. It just, it's still relatively recent for me. I was using masculine pronouns as recently as 2018. That's the year I made the shift publicly to feminine pronouns. So that's pretty recent for me to be out as a trans woman. Really in it's this funny experience where I realized that I needed to come out as a trans woman to just to be me. It had been a growing realization, and realizing it was going to come out right at the end of writing my doctoral dissertation. And I was like, do I have to put this in the dissertation, which was autoethnographic and very much about the experience of unmasking. And so I was like, do I have to put this in my dissertation? And I said, I can't, at this point, like I'd have to rewrite the entire thing with that to add that lens to it. And it's just too much. I mean, I have to write about it some other time instead. But this, I was right, I guess, from early on, really thinking about, queering gender performance from my adolescence, involved in queer activism from very early on. I've been involved in queer activism much longer than in autistic activism, because I knew I was queer in one way or another from much earlier. I knew I was genderqueer. I did not know I was trans. That took a while to be like, oh no, I'm a woman, and I just hadn't figured it out. But I was always very into like, okay, I don't want to perform masculinity. But I went back and forth a lot in my life of like these times when I was trying to perform masculinity as a form of masking, and it was terrible for me psychologically, and then letting go of it more, and letting myself queer gender performance and not comply. But I was still thinking of it as like, I'm not getting nailed down to this masculine gender performance. And when I recognized, oh wait, okay, I'm a trans woman, I realized quickly, I was like immediately looking into, how do I, transition, I guess I gotta like look into how do I start going on hormones and stuff like that. And I was like, wait a minute. I just spent like decades refusing to conform to a masculine gender performance. Why do I suddenly think I have to conform to a feminine gender performance now? I'm not going to. I like my head shaved. I like wearing pants that have real pockets, and I don't, and I mean, I'm in a very happy monogamous lesbian marriage, and my wife, who's also quite genderqueer, and much more on the masculine end of the spectrum than I am, in terms of temperament. I mean, she fully recognizes my femininity and likes my body the way it is. And it just didn't, like, same experience you had. It's like, I know who I am. I feel my femininity from the inside. I really don't need to do a conventional gender performance of being a trans woman by medically transitioning, or even cosmetically transitioning on the surface much.
And I think that in of itself is also really interesting, and I'm sure you will be able to answer this far better than my just ramblings, but about how that must connect to that neuroqueer theory and like narrative and identity and all sorts, in the sense of, why would you, as an autistic person, why would you transition in the way that a non-autistic person might consider transition? Does that make sense?
Exactly. So, right.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, there's a lot of autistic trans men and trans women who, and who have gotten a huge amount out of medically transitioning, doing the whole hormone thing and surgery and all that. And I am fully in support of this. You do whatever it is. I mean, that's part of the whole, this neuroqueer ethos, is you alter yourself in whatever way brings out who you are and who you want to be and who you want to become. And, so for me, it's this choice of I guess for me, I mean, I have my moments of gender dysphoria. I still have my moments of maybe I should transition, because it's a shock sometimes to look in the mirror and look totally different from what I feel like. But it's not worth it to me because of the inner experience of femininity I have being so sure and so strong, and because, you know, of just, you know, I'm in a marriage that, you know, where it kind of suits us both for me to stay untransitioned medically and such, and it's a lot of hassle and expense, and I'm kind of old. So for me, medically transitioning didn't make sense, and I love that as part of my queering of gender, that I'm even queering being trans. But when a fellow trans woman or a trans man does make the medical transition, oh, I'm rooting for them. I'm just cheering for them. I just love watching my trans brothers and sisters do the medical transition and do whatever.
And your point, that's a completely understandable and valid point, that transition means whatever it means for that individual. It doesn't necessarily mean, and I think it very much does confuse people. You know, I'm really lucky. I'm around lots of autistic university students. That means I learn, right? I learn far more than I would about experiencing gender and sexuality, like being queer and all this kind of thing, and how nuanced that can be. And outside of that space, I get very quickly come to realize that I live in a bubble, because you know, people who really find it difficult to understand why a trans non-binary person, well, one, that confuses them anyway, the idea that you're trans and non-binary, and that some people may want some forms of surgery and maybe top surgery but not bottom, or the other way around, and they find that very confusing because they really do want you to go from one of the binary, you know, to the other, and it's so much more nuanced and fluid than that. And so I think, yeah, I love it. And yeah, everybody's whether they're transitioning and in whatever way is completely valid, as long as they are happy with it. I think is the point, isn't it? I did want to ask, so this is something that came up when I've been doing the work with Annette, on you know, educating, for instance, our local NHS on why they are more likely to see LGBTQIA autistic people, or vice versa. Like if they, so basically we had a conversation with a fantastic charity or organisation that's connected to the NHS here, in my local area, so it's not like a UK-wide charity, and they are not a neurodivergent based charity. They are a transition, like young people who are transitioning based charity. But we had that conversation about, well, you are more likely though that you will be seeing autistic people come into your services and needing support. So I guess the question, if there is a question, is, to some extent, do you think it's more complicated, or sometimes that your queer identity and recognizing your queer identity, working that queer identity out, kind of maybe overshadows or means that you come to work out that you're neurodivergent, so, you know, autistic or what have you, later, like one overshadows the other? We've certainly seen the other way around as well, actually, people who know they're autistic and then they work out their gender and sexuality much later than perhaps a lot of their peers who've worked out their gender and sexuality.
Yes, I think makes sense. Yes, I think this is very much part of this whole idea of neuroqueer, this whole realm of neuroqueer and neuroqueerness I think this points to exactly what I was talking about as part of the essence of neuroqueer theory, is this idea that heteronormativity and neuronormativity are inextricably entwined. And so, yeah, you deviate enough from one, you're also deviating from the other, and you'll get flagged as something sooner or later. But what you get flagged as, in terms of a description of how you are diverging from normativity, varies depending on context, on life circumstances, and so maybe it gets recognized as queerness, maybe it gets recognized as neurodivergence, And in fact, at some level, it's so often both. It's so often, you know, just because they're so entwined. And it's, I think that it points toward, I think this really points toward, what you're describing really points toward that idea that like people discover, you know, if there's diverge sufficiently from neuronormativity, and you're also diverging from heteronormativity, because the binary heteronormative gender performance that's pushed on everyone is specifically a performance of neurotypical binary gender roles. And so by being neurodivergent, we're already not fitting into that. And likewise, there's something when one queers heteronormativity enough. I mean, heteronormativity shapes people's brains. You know, all our experience and our cultural conditioning happens biologically in the form of neural pathways building. And so if you get wildly queer enough with your gender, you're reshaping your brain in a way that's no longer neurotypical. It's deviated from the neural structures of heteronormativity. So it's all, you know, it's all entwined there. And what part you latch onto, you know, what part gets flagged and you say, oh, this is who I am. This explains the difference between me and others. That varies from person to person so much. This is, in fact, how the term neuroqueer got coined, at least by me. So there's a story there behind this. I mean, you did warn everyone this was going to be a rambling conversation, and I do ramble and diverge, and here we go. But I came up with the term neuroqueer, and my friend Athena Lynn Michaels Dillon, another autistic trans woman writer, also coined the term neuroqueer independently. And eventually, after we'd both been playing with the term for a while, but before we'd published anything about it in a public way, we discovered that we had both been playing with the same term and meant fairly similar things by it. And so that was an interesting conversation, which autistic scholar Remy Yergo was also a part of, and Remy became the first one to use neuroqueer in an academic publication in their book Authoring Autism. And so that was very much, it became a collaborative effort, and yet each one of us started out coining it independently. Somehow, you know, the concept was ready to be born, and it came to us before we had met each other. But from my experience in terms of coining neuroqueer and coming up with the concept, it happened. It was in 2008. So there's a long gap between me starting to play with the concept and it starting to appear in print. I was a grad student in somatic psychology at the time, in fact, the same somatic psychology program at California Institute of Integral Studies, which I teach in now. So I'm a grad student in somatic psychology. I actually a first year grad student still in 2008. And I had been writing a lot about, you know, in my schoolwork, just about my autistic experience. And somatic psychology, again, deals with the essential unity of mind and body, the idea that the psyche is an embodied psyche, and cognitive and psychological processes are embodied processes, and thus by working with the body, we can affect psychological change. So I'm in a class. It's got this wonderful instructor, Dr. Ian Grand. Ian passed away several years ago, and in fact, I now teach some of the classes that he used to teach. He was a very important mentor to me throughout my graduate academic career, and Ian was just. I mean, he was cisgender and heterosexual, but he was so very supportive of the idea of everyone finding their authentic selves, finding and creating this authentic embodied expression of who they are, which of course is so much the focus of my own work. And I was a huge influence on me in helping me learn to articulate this, and helping me, like, it was the first time I had encountered someone who was similarly devoted to that particular work, and is one of the more important teachers in my life. Anyway, so I'm in his psychodynamics class in my second semester of grad school, and what I'm writing about is masking, which at that time the autistic community didn't even have the word masking. I think in 2008 I hadn't seen anyone actually call it masking. I mean, sure, it was happening in like discussion forums and such, but I hadn't run across it yet. So I didn't even have the word masking for it. But I had been very much deeply exploring how to free my own body from habits of masking, and how to allow my spontaneous, authentic autistic self to emerge in my embodiment. That was very much the focus of my work, and part of what brought me to the field of somatic psychology. So I was writing an essay for class about that, and about my process of unmasking. And I remembered I was trying to write an example, a childhood memory of picking up this habit of masking. I was writing about hand movements, and how my autistic ways of moving and using my hands, and how I learned to suppress them and then reclaimed them, and how powerful it had been for me emotionally and cognitively to reclaim my autistic hands, my loud hands, as we say, right? And so so what I remembered when I was going back over my memories of, like, when was I bullied and abused and for moving my hands autistically, I was like, oh, autistic people who got subjected, that diagnosed as autistic early and got subjected to ABA and such, they were abused into masking and quiet hands because it was autistic. Moving your hands like that is not normal. It's an autistic, right? It violates neuronormativity. It's an autistic trait, and so the adults around the child are trying to make them suppress it because it's autistic. But that wasn't my experience, because I was in public schools and not diagnosed as autistic. My experience was, and this is like, I'm old, so I'm talking like 1970s here. My experience was I was attacked for being gay if I moved my hands autistically. And so it was flagged as a gender violation, as a violation of heteronormativity. And I learned to mask it to avoid homophobic attacks. So that was the moment. That was the light bulb going on over the head moment for me. Was this masking, this enforced normativity? It's the same quality, it's the same hand movements that violate normativity, and it can be flagged by the enforcers of normativity as a violation of neuronormativity or a violation of heteronormativity, depending on the context in which it happens. And that's where the term neuroqueer was born, was in that particular paper. And then I used it in grad school papers, that were clumsy enough that I'm glad I never published them, but use it in grad school papers for years before I thought of like writing anything public about it.
And it is always interesting to hear where people come up with things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go into it today, but for my own thesis, the work that I ended up doing, I can't tell anyone at this point why I ended up writing a really terrible play about being neurodivergent and neurodiversity, because I'm not, I have no arts background whatsoever. It just seemed like a good idea for some reason at my undergrad. Just one of those things, and I don't know, the planets aligned.
You got to follow the muse, follow your inspiration.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple of things I just want to quickly flag, because I know this person, I think they popped it twice because they were hoping that we would have a quick look.
Sure.
So they just explained that growing up in Arabic speaking countries as a gendered language was confusing, and I hated how even nouns, adjectives and verbs are either feminine or masculine, as it didn't sit right with that person.
Mm-hmm.
So there, I think, confusing. As an autistic, it's really hard to communicate that to neurotypical people. So yeah, they just wanted to, I think, let us know their experience. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, they're just talking about rejecting norms.
Yay for rejecting norms.
And I've got a question here from Sai. So does being non-hetero automatically mean neurodivergent?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's fuzzier than that, and I think that we make this is one of the reasons why I've moved away from identity politics and the idea of like what are you, because I think that the boundaries are much fuzzier than we make them out to be, and it's it becomes very fuzzy and very context dependent. At what point is someone diverging enough from neurotypicity to be considered neurodivergent or to be considered queer? And that might vary a lot. And I think that it's possible to be non-hetero and still stay within the boundaries of neuronormativity. And you know, you look at, I'm here, you know, in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there's a very long-standing gay community, and a lot of it is like, you know, affluent white cisgender gays who are very, you know, very much into they're playing their binary gender roles. But they're gay, you know, and they have gay marriages, gay relationships that look very heteronormative, except that it's a same-sex marriage. And of course, that's horrifying to the homophobes, you know, and bigots. But I think it's possible to do that and to just, you know, to live a very normative life, you know, when one can be in a situation like the San Francisco Bay Area where there's been enough, you know, enough of a successful fight against homophobia to allow something like that to exist. I think it's possible to be in a situation where one is living a very normative life, except for one's sexual preference for same gender, and one is still very much within neuronormativity in that sense. It's really when one starts getting outside of the gender binary entirely and queering one's gender performance in a dramatic way that one gets into the realm where that's also diverging from neuronormativity. So, you know,
and I think
yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we can see that, or there was definitely some great discussion when we had Erin Eakins on, and she wrote a book.
Queerly Autistic. I love that book. Yes, that's a terrific book.
And I think it's fair to say that would be really good. There's some good anecdotes and good descriptions about what would be more classed as neuroqueer compared to normative standards of being queer, right? So because she talks about, you know, you might be a gay man, for instance, but because you're autistic, you actually don't fit in to that normative idea of what it means to be gay.
Right.
And I've certainly had fantastic, I I say that about all my students, but I've certainly had fantastic students, autistic students, who like cis, but gay man, and he did not feel comfortable in a lot of spaces because it wasn't that autistic space. It didn't, he didn't feel, he wanted seemingly different things to sort of, I guess, the stereotype of what it means to be a gay man. So yeah, and so I thought that that was potentially a good demonstration of neuroqueer in that book.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's this interesting, you know, there's this within both the neurodivergent communities, you know, and you know, the autistic community in particular, I think, and within queer communities and gay communities, there is this tension between queering, between being openly queer or trying to compromise with normativity and fit within it somehow, and this has been an issue, you know, in terms of queerness for a very long time. It's kind of part of the foundations of queer theory. Michael Warner, gay activist and queer theorist, wrote an early, I guess it was probably what, late 1990s, wrote a book called The Trouble with Normal. That's sort of one of the foundational books of modern queer theory, where he warns against efforts by the gay community to go respectable, to do the whole, like, you know, hey, we were born gay, but we're just like everyone else, and we want, you know, these normative marriages and family structures and stuff. He's like, no, that's completely destructive to what we're trying to do. It lets people who can fit within that normative structure, you know, adopt respectability and separate from the rest of the community, and it's not good for this, you know, just queer communities as a whole. We should all be pushing against normativity. And of course, if you want, you know, your nuclear family structure and such, and you know, you're welcome to it. But ultimately, everyone's liberation depends on, you know, no, we're not doing normativity. We're not trying to make this respectable and say, hey, look, we're just like you. We're like, no, we're not like you, and
that's
you're
okay.
gonna have to accept that. Exactly.
Yeah, and almost like being penalized or punished for queering people's idea of queer.
Yes.
Like, and you're going against this again, a stereotype of what it even means to be queer, even with our beautiful, you know, LGBTQIA, that it's growing in terms of people recognizing it's not just lesbian and gay, for instance. It's much more than that, and that the boundaries are very fuzzy and fluid throughout that very large community. But yeah, even with that understanding, people still expect you to be queering in a particular way.
Yes, exactly. And so that normativity, and so I think that's where it becomes possible for people to be non-hetero, and yet, you know, and so they are violating heteronormativity, at least by who they're having sex with, but they're not really to where they're outside of neuronormativity, I think, in the way where someone is completely outside of binary gender performance, and just you know, in terms of, and especially again, my interest in embodiment and how that affects the mind and affects the cognitive processes. If one is violating the embodiment of heteronormative gender roles, and saying, well, how does my body actually want to move? How did my body want to move underneath all the cultural conditioning we receive from birth? That's where one starts to definitely get into, it starts to become neurodivergence as well. It starts to deviate from neuronormativity along with heteronormativity. But again, it's fuzzy, you know, this level of normative is relative, and that's where I don't like the identity politics of like, are you in the club or out of the club? I think because I think there's so much that happens on the borders.
And people
that.
struggle, yes, so many people struggle, even potentially, you know, people who are queer struggle with the idea that boundaries are fuzzy, and that they are fluid, which is why I did love the discussion as well with Erin Eakins, you know, helping to explain that to families and young people who are working this stuff out, that it's okay to say, I don't know, that you're bisexual one day and then the next day you work out actually you're pansexual, because it's not these rigid boxes. You're working that stuff out, which I quite liked as well.
And I think that's important. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
May I diverge again? I think that's important. Yeah. I think that's important. I think some of us are starting to get that around. I think that especially the newer, younger generations of queers are starting. I mean, there's some people like Judith Butler who are, you know, Judith Butler is even older than me, and I think, you know, they got that from very early on, you know. But especially, you know, now that we've had a couple generations of queer theory, and I think there's the younger generations of queer people who are much more aware of that, who really have internalized the fluidity of gender and the fluidity of sexuality, and the fuzziness of those boundaries, and are willing to embrace them and say, you know, I'm queer. Part of what makes us queer, part of what queering is that we're not doing we fit into these little boxes thing. And in a sense, an over-attachment to rigid categories of identity is very unqueer, is very normative. It's very much an attempt to impose some sort of normativity, to say, you know, you either fall in this particular category and meet these criteria, or you don't, you know. And it's no, like, this queerness is about fluidity very much, and recognizing the fuzziness of the boundaries and the arbitrariness of it and the way they change over time, and the fact that we don't have to stay in any given category. And it is an embracing of uncertainty, which I love. I mean, as you noted earlier on, like, I'm one of the, you know, the rare people you talk to in this in these videos who like spontaneity and doesn't want to know questions in advance. And that's a practice for me. That's a practice because it's just become an ongoing queer life practice for me, an ongoing neuroqueer practice for me, to embrace uncertainty all the time. And it's a challenge, and I deliberately challenge myself as part of my own neuroqueering process around that. But what I was going to say is that it happens, that same fluidity, I think we need to start recognizing it around neurodivergence as well. That I think that's a failing of the neurodiversity movement so far, that we're very much into rigid identity categories. We're very much into the neurodiversity movement is very into neurotypes, into the idea of, like, you know, okay, you're autistic and you're ADHD and you're dyslexic, and, you know, or you're autistic and ADHD, and, like, the idea that neurodivergence is about a particular set of categories. And that's not what the word neurodivergence was intended to mean. You know, when Cassiana Asasumasu coined the terms neurodivergent and neurodivergence more than 2 decades ago now. And, you know, and her I think that's amazing contribution that Cassiana is under recognized for. But she was very specific, and has since frequently reiterated the fact that she means by neurodivergent, she meant diverging significantly from neurotypicality in any way. So it doesn't mean you have to fit into the box of autism or the box of ADHD or whatever it is. If if you diverge sufficiently, if you diverge in a significant way from neurotypicality, if you queer neuronormativity sufficiently, you are neurodivergent. And it's not about like you have to have been born that way, or you have to have some sort of diagnosis. And I see people make these overgeneralizations. They say it's a neurodivergent trait and then they describe a common autistic trait or a common shared trait that you see in autism and ADHD, something like that. But no, like, there's a lot of neurodivergent people whose neurodivergence doesn't resemble an autism in any way. There's an infinite number of ways to diverge from neuronormativity, and all of those are neurodivergence. And there's also an infinite number of ways to be autistic, and at this point, because of the other ways that I've diverged from normativity, I mean, I queer the performance of autism too. So there's a lot of things I hear as autistic traits where I'm like, I am less like that than most neurotypicals are. Like the whole love of structure thing, the whole like, okay, there's these, I hear people say these certain things about autistic people, these stereotypes about like anxiety or liking, disliking spontaneity and change and such. And I'm like, I fit this description less than neurotypicals do. Like part of the work that I do is teaching neurotypicals to have less anxiety and be more okay with uncertainty, because I'm better at that than they are.
Is some of that, like you say, that you even queer being autistic, right? Is some of that conscious, like some conscious decision as well, because of the action of neuroqueering? So I'm not saying obviously everything, but is some of that like
absolutely
decision? Yeah.
Oh, very much. Yes.
I don't want to fit into your boxes of what autism is, and I will be autistic in my autistic way, or not even call it being autistic. I will call it whatever I might call it. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that is quite fair to say. I think that's entirely accurate. I mean, queerness is, if you read the queer theorists and such, like queerness is sort of inherently contrarian. It's very much, queerness stands in relation to heteronormativity. Like, what is it? It's a defiance of heteronormativity. It's a non-compliance with heteronormativity. And so, there is this refusal to comply, and refusing, neuroqueerness is this idea. Neuroqueering is this refusal to comply with heteronormativity or neuronormativity. And part of that, for me, is not just that I won't perform neurotypicality, I won't try to perform neurotypicality, I won't mask, but I also won't try to perform other people's definition of autism. I mean, the way being autistic is described usually by like the neurotypical authorities, or even by a lot of well-known autistic people, by like the Temple Grandins of the world and stuff, the description of autism just doesn't sound fun. It really sounds like Temple Grandin being like, yes, autistic people need certainty and structure, and we're not very affectionate, and we're full of anxiety and easily overwhelmed. And I'm like, I don't want to do any of those things. So I'm not going to. And there are there are practices. I mean, I'm an Aikido teacher, something I forgot to even mention at the beginning when I was talking about what I do. But, I've been an Aikido teacher for 40 years. And I'm I'm a lifelong Zen practitioner, and I've done, all these somatic practices, transformative mind-body practices. And all of these I regard as practices of queering. They're neuroqueering. Meditation alters the brain.
And I made a number of infographics when you were on last that are all about that, because absolutely, when I first came across neurodiversity, again, still relatively late, I would have been about 20, I think I was about 26, and it was 2012, and I found a book on neurodiversity and being neurodivergent, and it was in relation to mental health. It wasn't in relation, and I say mental health, people will be aware, I don't think of it as mental health or mental illness or anything like that, because of being lucky enough to come across neurodiversity very early on in my psychology undergraduate degree, because it didn't fit. I did have a train of thought. What was the train of thought? Oh yeah, and so a lot of the things that I made as infographics, just based on some of the things that you said, which was, I think what was really important as well is that you explaining that there is no neurotypical either. Like, I get frustrated when people do hear it and think of it as a biological model, and it's not.
Right.
So I get very frustrated with that and have to explain. I know it has the word neuro there, but we're talking about a much more fluid, I don't know how you might describe it, but I always describe it as a social model as opposed to this bio model. But just what you described about how there is no neurotypical, just some people are more able to perform neurotypicality.
Yes.
And even that was just, a fantastic way of explaining this to people. I think I had another train of thought and I've lost it.
Right. I mean, but I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, humans are biocultural beings. If there's one thing that's hardwired in us neurologically, neurobiologically, it's that we're hardwired to not be hardwired. We're wired to be shaped by culture on a neurological level, because we have this marvelous neuroplasticity where the brain, the neural connections, the webs of neural connection reshape themselves in response to experience and learning. And so our brains get shaped by our cultural learning. And in that sense, like, we say neuro, but we're not talking about like you're this way because your brain was born this. We're born this way. You were born with this kind of brain, and that's just the way you're destined to be now. You were born neurotypical, or you were born autistic. There's autistic people are born with certain tendencies, certain ways that they're certain things, there's certain qualities that distinguish autistic brains, but it's very loose, and a lot of just who we are is shaped by experience. And we talk about neuro, that prefix neuro, it's like, it's not an essentialist model, I think, or shouldn't be an essentialist model. We shouldn't take it that way of like, there's just a bunch of different types of brains that you're born with. Rather, it's, your brain is continually reshaped. Your whole, your brain and your psyche is shaped by experience and by action. And you can make choices around that. And that's essential, again, to what I consider the neuroqueer ethos, the foundations of neuroqueer theory and neuroqueer practice, is that we can make choices to alter our brains, to be like, I am going to alter myself, and customize this. Like, yeah, I'm autistic. Like, my brain from birth has these particular tendencies, but I want to customize this. I want to customize this and make alterations. So I'm going to find the practices that allow me to do this, and I'm going to do it. And it's not going to make an autistic person non-autistic, but there's so many ways of being autistic that we can create for ourselves that look nothing like the model that we're handed.
And I think, I think that's quite important, because otherwise, again, it's just us potentially trying to fit in even to those boxes of what it means to be autistic as according to the diagnostic manual. And many of us know none of us, no human being meets those criteria wholly and completely. And that's very, very problematic. I'm wondering, I feel like we've probably touched on a lot of these things. So I just want to see if there's any things you want to add to some of the notes that I'd made for myself. So one of them, which I'm hoping we feel like you've covered, obviously if you want to add anything, which was, what is neuroqueer theory and practice? I don't know if you want to say more to that.
Sure, I'll say more to that. So neuroqueer theory is essentially, I mean, it's an emerging body of theory that is just about the 2 points that I covered earlier, the idea of the idea of queering neuronormativity, and the idea of the intertwining of neuronormativity and heteronormativity, and just the idea that these things can be queered. And so, neuroqueer theory is essentially just like, okay, and what are our thoughts about that? What do we have to say about that? And I have a book coming out towards the end of this year, which I hope will be out in time for us to talk about it the next time that I get to speak with you. But there's a new essay in there on the basics of neuroqueer theory that articulates a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, but I think I articulate it much better in writing than I managed to in conversation.
What's really lovely though is then people can have both options, and they can probably listen to you talk about it in places like this, and then also read as well. I always like to give the option for both written and me waffling on.
Thank you. And I recommend, again, to those viewers and listeners who are interested in this, if they go to my website at neuroqueer.com, there's just a little place on the footer of the website, a little place at the bottom where you can enter your email address to subscribe to my newsletter. And then I don't annoy people with a lot of mailings. I send out a newsletter like once every couple months maybe, but that's how to make sure you get notified when the book comes out. So
fantastic. And size being in the comment section, putting in links and things, so we can just pop in. And neuroqueer, because obviously before it was neurocosmopolitanism,
right?
One of the very first sort of really key for me anyway websites that really helped me with all your essays to understand this narrative of neurodiversity. But neuroqueer, nice and clear and succinct, and much more about what you want it to be about. Is that?
Yes, exactly. I kind of had to rebrand at some point. I was like, I mean, I love the concept of neurocosmopolitanism, but at some point I was like, okay, my work is getting so queer that I just need like, and interestingly, I actually owned the domain name neuroqueer.com from about 2010. Before we even, went public. I think even before Athena Lynn, Michael Stillen, and Remy Yurgo and I had the conversation where we shared our thoughts about neuroqueer with each other. Like, I knew I wanted to do something with neuroqueer eventually, and grabbed that domain name in 2010 and just sat on it for a decade before I was like, it's time to just, that should be my website. That should be where you find my work.
And it's much easier to spell.
It is much easier to spell, yeah. So I'm glad that I went that way. Anyway, so yeah. Some of the old essays that used to be on neurocosmopolitanism, some of the key ones are on neuroqueer.com now, and will be collected in the book as well. And because people were always coming to me being like, I want to cite your work, but in my academic writing, but my professor won't let me cite websites because they're like, 80 years old and really stodgy. So So I'm like, okay, I'm just going to put this up in a book so people can cite it.
And I think that's a very frustrating practice, particularly when it comes to autistic community writing. There's so much work out there that is very valuable as you know, part of the discussing autistic people's experiences, but it's not real until it's, you know, in a published peer-reviewed article, and that's very frustrating. Some fantastic work. Did you want to say any more about this idea of neuroqueer practice?
Yes.
Is that more like we've discussed, or I'm wondering if this, like, when it says practice, is this like a program that you can do, or do you just mean in the grand scheme of neuroqueering as a action?
The grand scheme of neuroqueering is an action. So neuroqueer practice is indefinably broad. It's anything that neuroqueers. It's anything you do that helps to break the grip of neuronormativity and heteronormativity on your body mind. You know, we learn and on the culture. And so the act of neuroqueering is neuroqueer practice, whatever you do. And for me, it's very focused on the body because I'm a somatic psychologist. And so I'm very interested in, you know, okay, well, you know, we learn, you know, all autistic people learn some measure of masking. They have this masking forced on them. We learn to mask our autistic embodiment for our own safety because we're attacked for not, just like we learn to conform to the gender binary. And how do we unmask? What's this process of unmasking? Unmasking is, you know, the essence of neuroqueering in a way. What is, you know, it is, I mean, it's an essential neuroqueer practice is just the act of unmasking, the act of embodying ourselves, our neurodivergent selves, our queer selves, embodying ourselves in ways that queer neuronormativity, that queer heteronormativity, that deviate from them and subvert them. And this alters consciousness. It alters the brain because our neural structures and neural processes get altered by the way we move and the way we embody ourselves. And so I'm very interested in that. And, you know, that can mean like, I'm going to let myself move autistically. I'm going to tap back into the movement impulses I had as a child that I was taught to suppress. And what does that do for me? What's the effect of that? Do I want to do more of it? Let's keep playing with it. It's continuous play and experimentation. That can look like other things too. For me, my Aikido practice and my Zen practice are neuroqueer practices because there's a societal stereotype that says that because I'm neurodivergent, I'm supposed to be filled with anxiety and easily overwhelmed, and I'm just not interested in playing that role. And so I do practices that counter that, and just it's like the act of thriving and feeling good psychologically and not being in a state of anxiety, that is so counter to the stories that people tell about what it means to be autistic that it's irresistible to me. I love being happy and calm and at peace and joyful and not filled with anxiety. I mean, it's its own reward, but it's also a way of saying fuck you to neuronormativity. It's a way of saying fuck you to stereotypes about autism. Like, yeah, no, I just refuse to be miserable just because your diagnostic manual says that autistic people are unhappy. So there are practices that can change that. You know, there's a practice for it, and if there's not a practice for the change you want to make, one can create it. And then, of course, neuroqueer practice also extends to cultural practice as well, to neuroqueer, you know, what are neuroqueering practices in literature? How do you convey these ideas? And of course, we set out to talk about neuroqueer life and literature, and we focused on neuroqueer life this time, so maybe we'll get to literature next time. when there'll be a book to talk about. But that's the nature of spontaneity.
But this is the thing, I love these conversations because it's just, I've got lots of thoughts that I need to process, and then I know I'm going to do the same thing I did last time, which is it's just going to make me think of so many things. So yes, that would be lovely to discuss that again. Yes, thank you, Sai. This was quite an interesting one. I don't know if you can contribute an answer to this at all. So can Dr. Nick talk about her experiences receiving support and accommodations outside the normal boxes?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, I didn't get support and accommodations for most of my life. You know, again, I wasn't diagnosed as autistic early on, and I don't necessarily, you know, my early life, my childhood and young adulthood are not things I would recommend to anyone. You know, I grew up in poverty with extensive abuse and trauma, and you know, part of what led me to neuroqueering practices was just working to heal and transform my trauma and recover from it. And so for me, you know, I hope that we have a world where people, you know, I would like to see a world where it was easier for people to get support and accommodations and not have to compromise who they are and be forced into normativity in order to do that. For me, I've always sought my own forms of support and accommodation because of the lack of normal boxes. So I did indeed
recognize that from you discussing
create my own. I will say I wrote about this in my doctoral dissertation, which I'll turn into a book eventually, but in fact, the entire dissertation can be downloaded from neuroqueer.com for those who are masochistic enough to want to read an actual doctoral dissertation, which I guess in Britain it's a doctoral thesis, right? But for instance, Aikido for me as a practice, I started training when I was 12, and I that turned into that was an environment where the accommodations that I needed were built in, where I didn't have to ask for them because, of course, autistic listeners are, you know, very aware that one of the issues we face is that we're expected to do these performances of neuronormativity and these performances of neurotypical ideas of politeness, and, you know, play these particular social games and such, but nobody tells us the rules. And so we're always in trouble for violating the rules. And I think this is where so much autistic anxiety comes from. And when I came to my first Aikido class, you know, at the age of 12, kind of expecting more of the same in terms of social environment, what I found was here's this environment that follows the strict old-fashioned Japanese martial arts school etiquette, where nobody comes in knowing the rules because they're not Japanese, and even for Japanese people, old school martial arts dojo etiquette is not everyday etiquette. And so the rules have to be explained to everyone, and they're so clear. It's like somebody talks to you, you know, you bow. The sensei gives you, you know, an instructor gives you an instruction. You're like, "Hi, sensei," and you follow the instruction. And it's all the interactions were so clearly laid out, and there's this a formal social rule for everything, and I loved it. It was like that bit of anxiety wasn't there. So in a sense, I call that in my dissertation, I call that an organic social accommodation, because it's built into the structure. Yeah, it's like it wasn't created to be an accommodation. It was created because that's just like old school Japanese martial arts tradition, but the explicitness of it made it perfect for a young autistic person. And so a lot of times I looked for things like that. You know, I chose I went to California Institute of Integral Studies, where I now teach, rather than a larger university, and it's a small, very eccentric private college that has, a history of being very involved with things like Buddhist studies and psychedelics research and exotic Jungian stuff. And so that environment was perfect for me, an environment full of the kind of people who want to do psychedelics research and such, was perfect for an autistic person because, I could walk around the school barefoot, just sort of sit and stim and rock back and forth. And like, chances are, there were a bunch of other people in the school doing the same thing for their own reasons because, they'd been, up tripping on shrooms the night before or something. So, so I found a place that was kind of already designed to accommodate strange people, rather than going to a large university and trying to fight for accommodations that would be very hard to get.
One of the saddest things, I think, and then Autopia. We talk about Autopia a lot. So one of the sad things, and something quite interesting, so we had autistic orientation for our new students at the university. And we make a really good concerted effort as autistic people to make sure that our autistic students are also feeling accommodated and all sorts. But what I noted and what was kind of interesting and also kind of sad is, so we had 3 orientation days. So they're allowed to turn up, the autistic students that disclose to the university, they're allowed to turn up slightly earlier than the rest of the cohort, which means that the campus is quieter. They do things throughout the day with the student support and wellbeing and the autism team. So those are non-autistic disability advisors and so on. They do things like talk about accommodation and do a tour of the campus and things. And then in the afternoon, they meet me and Annette. And what's really quite interesting to see is that we will discuss, what we offer. We offer a University of Kent Autistic Social Group. We've got So You're Autistic ? Pre and post diagnostic support program. We call it pre and post diagnostic, but again, for us, the diagnostic part is really not of interest necessarily to us. It's just that's kind of how we've pitched it to the university. So we're telling them all about these things. There's me and Annette. We've got our shoes off. We're sitting on the floor. I have to explain. I'm Dr. Chloe Farahar. What? You're an academic? Yes. We've got all our STEM tools and objects and things on the floor. And eventually we ask, anyone is welcome to come down. So we've got a room of 20. Like I say, we did this across 3 different days. So we had 60 students across 3 days. And we're all sitting on the floor, the ones that were comfortable enough to sit on the floor with us, with the STEMI objects and doing all this kind of thing. And then there's a few that are still around the outside. And I go and sit with them just to check if they're okay. And just asking quietly, is this the most autistic people you've probably ever been around? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, okay. And it's just so uncomfortable for them because it's so alien to them to have a bunch of adults sitting on the floor, not looking at each other, talking about our dedicated interests, whatever those might be. And yeah, so it is quite a harsh, it brings us right back to reality. Again, I'm in my little bubble. I'm in my lovely bubble that I have created for myself. I'd love to get to that point of not being anxious. So I don't know if I'll ever get there, but it is quite hard to watch. But something I did notice, and I just wanted to, I think we might be wrapping up soon, but I just wanted to kind of touch on this because it is something I've noticed a few times in the last few weeks. I've also just, around the time we were doing the autistic orientation with students, the same week, I was also attending an autistic-led autistic conference, and not an autism conference, it was an autistic conference with a few neurotypical neurotypicals thrown in. Who were invited to speak as well, but predominantly it was autistic people. But something I noticed, and I just thought you would have a better understanding potentially than I will, is what we noticed is that the students and actually some pupils for another project, so completely separate to the autistic orientation students, the students that had understood or looked into and started to work out their queer gender, their queer sexuality, and also knew they were autistic, they seemed to have a slightly better self-esteem,
Yes.
slightly better pride in their queer, in all senses of the word, identities. And I just found that really important and interesting, like that protective property of queer pride. They kind of brought that with them to their autistic identity. I don't know if that, you probably have seen this.
Oh, yes, yes, I agree. I think that, again, neurotypicality and, neuronormativity and heteronormativity are so entwined. And so the performance of neurotypicality means really the performance of binary gender roles, among other things. One is, and if you look at, what sort of normal is ABA, for instance, trying to force on people? It's, what they're trying to force is normative performance of gender roles. Normal is always gendered. It's always both neuronormativity and heteronormativity. Nobody, all of the ABAers and other people who are trying to force autistic people to act neurotypical, nobody's saying act like a non-binary neurotypical person. It's always act like a good little normal boy or a good little normal girl. And so autistic people are, and that's, again, that understanding is part of what's the essence of neuroqueer theory there. And so I think that autistic people, we pick up this internalized oppression, this internalized sense that there's something wrong with us. And so part of neuroqueering is refusal to go along with that, saying, just refusing that internalized normativity. But we are not neurotypical, and that means we're not following neurotypical binary gender performance. And I think that autistic people who have not addressed their queerness, it's very easy for them to have shame around that. And so I see a lot of autistic people, I think autistic, heterosexual autistic men especially, there are a lot who are trying so hard to do that normative gender performance, and they're really doing like toxic masculinity and this normative masculinity to an extreme, and some really prominent ones. In fact, some of the better known ones are in terms of like, older, more long-standing people in known autistic writers and activists and speakers and stuff who are very, very cis-normative in their gender presentation, very classically male. And I think that there's a lot of internalized shame there. I think there's a lot of shame at early failures that, what they see as failures, what we're seeing as adults around them as failures, early failures to perform like a normal boy. And so I think that shame is still there. That shame of failure at heteronormative gender performance is there for a lot of cisgendered heterosexual autistic people, and it really keeps them locked into very rigid embodiments. And I see that just watching some of the long-standing like male autistic public figures. I really see that, and it's painful to look at, that they seem so trapped by that kind of normativity, even though they've come out as autistic and are like, yay, autistic pride. or whatever, they're limited by trying to continue to perform that normativity. And so, yeah, I think that coming out as queer, recognizing one's queerness and embracing it, can be a necessary antidote to that. Like, yeah, I'm not normative, you know, I'm queer, I'm neuroqueer, I'm not neuronormative or heteronormative. And the history of queer community and queer activism and queer pride really provides a model for us for how to do that. And yeah,
that's what I felt like I was seeing, and yeah, and I just thought there was some great psychological and emotional protective properties for those individuals. I mean, as an example that's a public example, so I don't have to use any personal examples. A video is called, I think it's called "I Feel Different," that was created by the Playing a Part project that I'm on the steering group for. Part of that video, it was actually quite a depressing video to watch. It's all these sort of narratives that have been, and quotes taken from these young autistic pupils, so largely girls, but some non-binary people in that as well, in that group. And the little quotes and things were really quite negative, and, you know, even the pictures, it was all cartoon. But what I think was interesting was at the end, I think they had 4 of the girls on as cartoons, and they're explaining that to be autistic is means different things for different people. So the first one was a little character, and they're saying, I'm autistic, but I'm very quiet and very shy. The other one was like, I'm autistic and whatever it is they said. And then you've got the autistic who said, and I can't remember in what way they were queer, but they described, and I'm part of the LGBTQIA community, and they had so much more, they just seemed so much more empowered. Yeah. And so yeah, I think obviously not wanting to take from the queer community if an individual doesn't necessarily think that they are queer in the sense of their gender and their sexuality per se, but definitely just trying to recognize that we could try and build that a bit better, I guess, within our own autistic community. I think we try, but the queer community has been doing it for a much longer time.
Yes.
Trying to build that pride, or have built.
And there's such an overlap. There's so much overlap. And I think there could be a lot more. You know, there's so many trans autistic people, so many queer autistic people. We're a queer bunch because, again, of the intertwining of neuronormativity and heteronormativity, you know, and in a sense, we, you know, just our divergence from neuronormativity at some point becomes a divergence from heteronormativity necessarily. We diverge from the performance of gender, and the performance of the heteronormative gender binary. And I think we could do that more. You know, I think that any autistic person really fully finding the potential for weird autistic embodiment, their weird, unique potential, and really exploring the fullness of what it means to allow an autistic body mind to grow as an autistic body mind. I think that anyone going in that direction far enough is going to diverge from heteronormative gender performance, binary gender performance enough that they would qualify as queer in the gender sense as well. And so, in a sense, we all could be part of the queer community if we want to explore that direction. And I think it's a good explanation. You know, so I think it's a good exploration. So, you know, I guess I'm sort of come around to this radical idea that, like, every autistic person has enormous potential to be queer, and that I want to encourage everyone to pursue and explore and cultivate that potential.
I think that's a very, I do like my quotes. That's a very good thing that I might end up quoting. Obviously citing yourself. I made so many quotes the last time you were on that I share. Yes, thank you so much. Been some lovely discussions, people just back and forth with each other, having these discussions. And some people, what I quite liked, I think it was Samara. So Samara is one of our modmins, and Samara was saying, thank you so much for this. A light bulb is finally coming on slowly over my head regarding the whole neuroqueer concept. Thought it was above my head for the longest time and didn't tackle it. So yeah, lovely. I think that's been very, very helpful for so many people. And like I say, I'm going to process so many things. And Samara was saying that they were taking notes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And again, I mean, a book will be out before the end of the year is my hope. And so I hope that will, that puts some of the stuff into writing, which might be easier to follow for some.
Fantastic. And we will be having Nick back on in December. And hopefully, I mean, even if it's not published, surely you can come on and do a little teaser for people so that they can get ready to go.
Maybe a little reading or something.
That would be fantastic. Oops, yeah. I got very excited then. So I was like, oh, about the reading. He's very excited.
Excellent.
About that. Fantastic. So if I can ask my final question that we ask all our guests, which is, what at this point in time is your favorite stim?
Ooh, my favorite stim. That's a beautiful, beautiful question. And it really almost varies a lot from day to day, but I find I'm really enjoying this sort of spirally hand rubbing motion lately. I've been doing this a lot lately and really just sort of emerged, and I found it interesting. Anthony Hopkins, the actor, came out as autistic just fairly recently, and he talked about rubbing his hands together as stimming, which is great because his hand rubbing is a very Hannibal Lecter sort of gesture or something, lovely there about that. But for me, it's the hand rubbing is much more. It seems to be much more spirally there, and more like there's some sort of like vine-like or aquatic life form-like vibe to it here. So yeah, I'm really digging that.
Fantastic. I love that question. And we ask it for a number of reasons. Sometimes we have talked about a very sensitive topic, so it's quite nice to try and end on something if we couldn't find anything necessarily positive. I will say, I'll ask the real question. Hold on. I will in a second. Sorry, it's a running joke. So yeah, I like to ask it because yes, it might have been a sensitive discussion that's been had. And so, but I also like to see what everybody replies with, because everyone's are so different.
Yes.
And for a while we had a string of guests where their favorite stim at that point in time was very auditory, for instance, and then a number of other guests it might be more tactile. So you've described something tactile, and I just love seeing the differences across our guests. It's really great. And I mentioned this recently that I was quite disappointed and quite sad, and I shouldn't go on Reddit. I don't actually go on Reddit anyway, but my partner who's autistic with attention differences was looking at Reddit, and it was just this lovely video of this autistic young woman with her best friend, and she was showing him her stims, and she was making him do them with her, and there was a lot of real rocking movements and things. It was really, really lovely. And then the comments was full of, this is fake, stims aren't conscious and all this kind of thing. And I'm like, they should be, though. If we can get to a good, safe place to be stimming consciously, we can help ourselves regulate. And
this is part of the essence of neuroqueer practice too. This is what neuroqueer practice is very much what it's about. It's this, like, there's an intentionality to it. Whereas neurodivergent, you just might be born neurodivergent or become neurodivergent through the course of events. Neuroqueerness, really, there's a taking charge of it thing that happens of, just like with gender, like at some point, you might just not fit into the gender binary very well, but people make a choice also of, I'm coming out. I'm going to be gay. I'm going to be queer. I'm going to have gay sex. I'm going to dress up in this outrageous, fabulous outfit. I'm just, I'm not going to perform heteronormative embodiment. And it's the same thing. Like, I'm not going to perform neuronormative embodiment. Like, I'm going to explore my capacity for stimming, you know, what emerges spontaneously, but also what can I find and play with and make a part of my embodiment? There is that intentionality is part of the beauty of it, that we're not. Remy Yurgo in Authoring Autism talks about this wonderfully, where they talk about that so much of the pathologizing discourse on autism talks about autism as a lack of intentionality, like we're just like at the mercy of our faulty neurons or something. And so there's something wonderfully queering of that, and just to insist on like, no, I'm going to really intentionally take charge of the direction of my neurodivergence and my neuroevolution.
And again, that's also why I really like finding out other people's stims, because then I might find one and be like, oh, right, I'm going to start trying this one. This one feels good, or this one, yeah, for what? Because you get to test things. Right, okay, I will ask. Okay, Si, I don't know, again, Nick is in America. So there's this ongoing joke stroke feud amongst the Aucademy modmins. Oh, have you changed it? Originally, the joke has been mayonnaise or salad cream, and we ask our guests which team would you be on? Is it team mayonnaise or team salad cream?
I reject both.
Okay.
I reject both. I'm a hummus girl. Yes, as a Jew, I'm strictly team hummus. I won't do mayo, and I put hummus in my salad. And
I'm assuming you've probably never had salad cream?
I mean, is it anything like the American salad dressing, or is it different?
No, I think I'm thinking, is it Samara? Samara's in America, and I know Bobby's from America, and they talk about Miracle Whip, which is much sweeter.
Oh, Miracle Whip. Yeah, no, I don't do that stuff either. Nope, strictly hummus.
There you go. There's your answer, Si. What was your other question? Did you put a new one just to demand avoidant the question? Star Trek or Star Wars, and why Star Trek?
I like them both.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Nick. Just stay on with us while I just do the wrap-up part and do our outro.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Victoria says ultimate respect, because Victoria gets very frustrated with the mayonnaise versus team salad cream feud. So next week, everybody, we have lovely Nikki Duncan, and we are going to talk about ADHD, really. And I found this really interesting when I was talking to her, because I don't necessarily feel that I experience attention differences that would be classed as ADHD, but my partner does. But what was really interesting from the discussion I've had with Nikki is that she gets frustrated because for her, the attention differences aren't the thing that makes that experience. So I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion to really pick apart this pathologizing of attention differences. So I'm quite looking forward to that one as well. Give it a good picking apart and ripping it to pieces. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and I will see you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chloe. It's lovely to talk to you again.
You are most welcome. It's fantastic. I love it.